In the 1950s, the smartest politicians in Nigeria believed they understood where power was heading. The South had newspapers, the universities, the seaports, the industries, the educated elites, industrial exposure. Everything about colonial Nigeria seemed to suggest that the future belonged to southern politicians like Nnamdi Azikiwe and Obafemi Awolowo. And yet, by the time independence arrived in 1960, it was Ahmadu Bello who had positioned the North to dominate Nigerian politics. Not Azikiwe, not Awolowo, Ahmadu Bello. And the strangest part is that many of his rivals didn't fully understand what he was doing until the game was already over. Because Bello's greatest weapon was not simply population, it was perception. The South believed the North was politically backward. They believed Northern leaders feared modernity. They believed the North depended on British protection to survive politically. Some even believed Bello himself was a conservative aristocrat being manipulated by colonial authorities. They believed Bello was a puppet of the colonial masters. But what if that assumption was the greatest political miscalculation in Nigerian history? What if the man everyone thought was weak was actually the most dangerous strategist in the room? Because when you look carefully at the politics of the independence area, something unusually begins to emerge. Bello consistently got what he wanted. He maneuvered the British, he maneuvered Azikiwe, he maneuvered Awolowo, and in the end, the structure of independent Nigeria reflected Bello's priorities more than anyone else. The North got population-based representation. The North secured the largest number in the parliament. The North retained Ilori and Kaba provinces. The federal structure protected regional autonomy, and while southern politicians fought bitterly among themselves, Bello quietly unified the North behind a long-term strategy. Even today, historians still argue over how he pulled it off. To understand the answer, you have to go back long before independence. You have to go back to the old Sokoto Caliphate. One of the biggest mistakes many southern nationalists made was assuming that Western education was the only meaningful form of political training. Because the North had fewer missionary schools and universities, many southern elites concluded that northern politicians were politically inexperienced. But they misunderstood what northern Islamic education actually was. Islamic education in the Sokoto tradition was deeply connected to governance, administration, law, hierarchy, taxation, diplomacy, and social organization. This was not simple religious instruction. It was political training rooted in centuries of statecraft. And Bello was one of the finest products of that system. Born in Raba in present-day Sokoto state, Bello grew up inside an aristocratic tradition linked to Usman Dan Fodio. Long before Nigeria existed as a country, the Sokoto Caliphate had already governed massive territories across northern Nigeria. It had emirs, district heads, courts, tax system, military organization, and political hierarchies stretching across enormous distances. While many southern nationalists saw colonialism as the beginning of political awakening, Bello and much of the northern aristocracy saw the British differently. To them, the British had interrupted the already existing political civilization. Northern Nigeria was not an empty territory waiting for modern politics. It already had governing systems before colonial rule arrived, and the British quickly realized this. Unlike in the South, where colonial authorities relied more on direct administration and missionary expansion, the British governed the North through indirect rule. They preserved the emirate system because it worked. In many areas, the traditional political organization of the North was more efficient than anything the British could have created themselves. This is where Bello gained one of his greatest advantages. Before Bello became a major national politician, Bello served as district head of Raba under the native authority system. This was not symbolic leadership, it was real administration at a grassroots level. He collected taxes, supervised local chiefs, settled disputes, maintained order, and dealt directly with colonial officials. Think about that carefully. While Azikiwe was learning how to inspire crowds through newspapers, Bello was already governing people. While Awolowo was mastering political organization and legal argument, Bello was learning how authority moved from village structure upwards through real administrative systems. He understood how to negotiate with emirs. He understood how to manage ethnic tensions. He understood how ordinary people responded to power. He understood bureaucracy. He understood hierarchy. Most importantly, he understood patience. That experience mattered enormously later. Because one of the most fascinating parts of Bello's political rise is that he allowed his opponents to underestimate him. The South believed the North was dependent on British and the puppet of the British. Bello quietly encouraged that perception. It lowered suspicion. Southern politicians often treated Northern caution as weakness instead of strategy. But behind closed doors, Bello repeatedly made it clear to the British colonial masters the Northern interest came first. This is how he exploited the British. This is where the story becomes almost shocking. The British believed they were managing the North through indirect rule. Southern nationalists believed Bello was too close to colonial authorities. Yet Bello may have understood both sides better than they understood him. He knew exactly what frightened the British. They feared instability above all else. They feared rapid decolonization. They feared ethnic violence. They feared administrative collapse. Bello used those fears brilliantly to maneuver the British. While Southern politicians often confronted colonial authorities emotionally and publicly, Bello projected caution, discipline, and stability. To British officials, he appeared reasonable, patient, and responsible. He looked less like a revolutionary trying to destroy the system and more like a statesman protecting order. There was also a subtle psychological factor working in Bello's favor. Britain itself was deeply shaped by monarchy and aristocratic traditions. Bello, as a royal aristocrat connected to the Sokoto Caliphate, naturally spoke a political language British elites instinctively respected. He understood how to negotiate without appearing confrontational, and that became decisive during the Constitutional Conference of 1950s. At conferences in Lagos, Ibadan, and London, Bello pursued a remarkable consistent strategy. He wanted strong regional government instead of an overly centralized federation. He insisted that representation in parliament should heavily reflect the population. He demanded safeguards for northern autonomy, and he argued repeatedly that independence should come gradually rather than immediately. At first, many southern politicians misunderstood what was happening. They believed the North was simply afraid. But Bello was not afraid. He was buying time and using delay tactics to frustrate Azikiwe and Awolowo. This is one of the most important moments in Nigerian political history. Across Africa, anti-colonial nationalism was accelerating rapidly. Southern politicians, especially Azikiwe, desperately wanted independence as quickly as possible. Bello recognized that urgency and quietly turned it into leverage. Treacherously, whenever Bello wanted a concession, he would blame the 1914 amalgamation, and he would say, "The mistake of 1914 has come to light again." Or he would threaten separation of the northern region from Nigeria. To many Southerners, this sounded like insecurity and backwardness, but politically, it was genius. Bello presented the North as educationally disadvantaged and politically cautious. In doing so, He slowed the pace of constitutional change while extracting concessions that threatened northern influence. And then, Bello made the move that may have changed Nigeria forever. He pushed the population to the center of political representation. That single principle transformed the entire balance of power. The North possessed the largest population in Nigeria. Once parliamentary representation became tied primarily to population, the North gained a structural advantage inside the federal legislature that would shape Nigerian politics for decades. This was the moment many Southern politicians failed to fully appreciate what Bello was building, because while Bello focused on long-term northern power, the South was increasingly divided against itself. Azikiwe and Awolowo didn't merely disagree politically, they represented competing visions of Nigeria itself. Azikiwe believed in a strong central government because he saw Nigerian nationalism as the path towards unity. Awolowo preferred stronger regions because he feared domination by the North. That disagreement weakened Southern bargaining power from the very beginning, but the rivalry went even deeper than ideology. Azikiwe's growing influence in Lagos deeply worried Awolowo. Lagos was not just another city, it was the economic heart of colonial Nigeria. Whoever controlled Lagos controlled enormous political and economic influence. Awolowo wanted stronger Yoruba influence in Lagos. Azikiwe's popularity threatened that ambition. Instead of forming a united southern political front capable of challenging northern population power, both men increasingly competed against each other. The South had the advantage of access to the sea and a thriving industrial base. Awolowo and Azikiwe both were unable to maximize their leverage on the North. Lack of sea access as the North was landlocked. They failed to press this advantage to obtain any concession from the North. Any advantage the South has, Ahmadu Bello made it look like a leverage to dominate the North and demanded protection against domination. Bello watched all of this happen and he benefited from it immensely. Because while the South fragmented politically, Bello concentrated on something much larger, unifying the North. This may have been Bello's greatest political achievement. Northern Nigeria was extraordinarily diverse. It contained Hausa population, Fulani aristocrats, Kanuri communities, thief groups, Nupe population, and many Middle Belt ethnicities. Yet Bello largely succeeded in organizing the region politically under the umbrella of the Northern People's Congress. How? Bello's politics didn't rely solely on modern party structures. It rested on traditional systems that already existed across northern society. Emirs, district heads, native authorities, Islamic scholars, and local rulers formed a network people already trusted. In many parts of the North, the MPC did not feel like a new political party. It felt like the continuation of the existing Islamic authority. That gave Bello extraordinary grassroots reach. This is another major difference between Bello and his southern rivals. Southern parties depended heavily on modern electoral mobilization. Bello's political structure rested on both modern politics and traditional authority simultaneously. He was operating in two political worlds at once. And then he introduced one of the most powerful slogans in Nigerian political history: the North for the Northerners. To critics, it sounded dangerous. To supporters, it sounded defensive. Bello convinced many Northerners that Southern politicians wanted to dominate them through Western education, bureaucracy, and centralized government. By positioning himself as the defender of Northern autonomy, he unified conservative Northern opinion behind the NPC. By independence in 1960, the outcome was obvious. The MPC emerged as the largest political party in Nigeria. Bello controlled the largest bloc in parliament. His ally Abubakar Tafawa Balewa became prime minister. And then Bello did something unexpected. He refused to become the prime minister himself. Most politicians would have rushed to occupy the most powerful office in the country. Bello did the opposite. He remained in Kaduna as premier of the northern Nigeria. At first glance, this decision seemed strange, but it revealed something profound about how Bello understood power. He knew that the real center of political strength was not necessarily Lagos, it was the north itself. Whoever controlled the north controlled the largest voting bloc, the strongest regional structure, and the most important political foundation in Nigeria. Bello did not need the title of Prime Minister to dominate the Federation. He already understood where real power lived, and perhaps that is why historians still struggle to fully explain him. Azikiwe inspired nationalism. Awolowo built modern political organization, but Bello combined traditional authority, administrative experience, demographic strategy, grassroots organization, and patient negotiation into one political machine. He turned northern caution into leverage. He turned educational weakness into bargaining power. He turned population into constitutional dominance. And while his rivals often focused on immediate political battles, Bello focused on the long game. That may have been his greatest advantage of all, because Bello was not simply thinking like a modern politician competing in elections. He was thinking like the heir to the Sokoto Caliphate. And in the end, that deeper understanding of power may have allowed him to outmaneuver everyone around him. The real question is whether the South ever truly understand what it was dealing with before it was too late. And perhaps an even bigger question remains today. Was Bello simply protecting northern interests inside Nigeria, or was he quietly designing a political structure to take over the rest of Nigeria?